Classical conditioning is not the only kind of conditioning. While Pavlov had shown the importance of learning relationships between two stimulus events, an American psychologist named Edward Thorndike pioneered the study of another kind of learning around the turn of the century. Thorndike was interested in how individuals learn solutions to the complex puzzles the world devises. How do we and other animals learn the habits and new skills that enable us to find our way through life's mazes? By carefully observing, measuring, and quantifying the performance of experimental animals, Thorndike discovered the type of learning we call instrumental conditioning. Thorndike's animals worked by trial and error. The actions that brought reward, that is, the actions that were instrumental to achieving a goal, became learned. To Thorndike, it's the consequences of what an individual does that most influence the learning process. Thorndike's law of effect states that learning is controlled by its consequences. Those behaviors followed by good consequences are selected and repeated, while those leading to bad consequences, or no consequences at all, are not repeated. Another American psychologist who was greatly influenced by Pavlov was John B. Watson. Watson believed that learned, observable behavior was the only thing in psychology worthy of scientific study. He attacked the doctrines of inherited traits and instincts as the cause of behavior. Instead, he spoke of the unlimited power of conditioning and environmental control to mold the behavior of animals and humans alike. To study the power of conditioning, Watson used infants as subjects, as you can see in this original footage from the 1920s. Watson showed that strong emotions could be learned in one situation by conditioning and then generalized, that is, transferred to other similar situations without having to repeat the original conditioning. Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Reyna, conditioned the infants to fear a white rat they had liked at first. In this case, they worked with an 8-month-old called Little Albert. Each time the rat was presented, a loud gong was struck, startling the infant. Soon the appearance of the rat alone was enough to make him cry and become fearful. This was classical conditioning at work. When the child crawled away from the rat towards safety, her behavior was rewarded, in that her fear was reduced. Instrumental conditioning was now at work. Later, when the children saw any stimulus that was similar to the rat, a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, a mask, their learned fear was generalized to all of them. The once fearless children were now easily frightened by a host of harmless things. Watson's pioneering study was controversial because of the way he used children. Such an experiment could not be conducted today because of strict ethical guidelines governing the treatment of all research subjects, humans and animals. A few years after the demonstrations, an associate of Watson, Mary Cover-Jones, developed techniques for removing naturally conditioned fears in youngsters. Jones was the first behavior therapist. But these techniques came too late for some of Watson's subjects. Little Albert's fate remains unknown. Another towering figure in the study of learning was Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner. Skinner built upon the ideas of Pavlov, Thorndike, and Watson, and was interested in how behavior is influenced by external events in our lives. For many psychologists, behavior is explained as an effect of internal processes, either mental or neural. For them, behavior is seen as the outward expression of what's going on inside. But Skinner disagrees. His research investigates behavior in terms of its relationship to environmental variables that precede and follow it. You can think of it as psychology's ABCs: antecedents, behavior, consequences. In the early 1940s, Skinner began to examine a simple response of an ordinary animal, a pigeon pecking a disc that was followed by a reinforcer, say a food pellet or some water. A reinforcer is anything that increases the rate of responding.
Wait for it to turn a little further.
The pigeon was kept in a highly controlled environment that's come to be known as a Skinner box. And Skinner's version of instrumental conditioning is known as operant conditioning.
Well, operant behavior is behavior which operates upon the environment and produces consequences. And operant conditioning is the change that takes place when those consequences have a particular effect. And we call this effect strengthening or reinforcing.
Through operant conditioning, pigeons have been trained to peck at the correct sum of numbers and to perform all kinds of feats. Operant conditioning is one important aspect of learned behavior. But in Skinner's view of psychology, all learned behavior can be stripped down to the relationships between the behavior, its antecedents, and its consequences. He believes that any behavior that is followed by a consequence will change in its rate of occurrence in direct relationship to changes in the consequence. Operant conditioning has been applied in several settings beyond the research laboratories where it was first discovered.
These are not mechanical devices. These are dogs. That means that they don't always do everything perfectly every time.
This promotional film shows a San Diego training program called Canines for Independence. Using behavioral principles, these dogs have learned to assist in the care of disabled patients. Desired behaviors are reinforced by means of operant conditioning until the dog learns a new routine in which a complex sequence of responses are chained together.
So I got him to jump up on the table, and it took me about 3 or 4 times telling him what I wanted. And then he got it and handed it to me. And now he just does it all the time. It is just one command for him to get it. Now I don't have to.
The dogs learn to retrieve objects. They learn to pull wheelchairs and even push elevator buttons.
Atta boy. Good boy. I didn't know it was going to be like this when I first started, but after I went through it, it's all come true. After learning all these commands, everything that I've learned, you know, it's working. It's all working.
This woman is undergoing behavior therapy for agoraphobia. Agoraphobia, the fear of public places, imprisons untold numbers of people, mostly women, in their homes.
That's good. Just take that deep breath. That's good. We're going to have one more step.
The unique feature of this behavior therapy is its pragmatic focus on directly changing the problem behavior, the individual's symptoms. There's no attempt to find out what caused the behavior, only identifying and changing the sources of reinforcement that keep it going in the wrong direction. The problem is treated by learning to cope with a fearful emotion and by arranging new positive consequences for the desired behavior.